He stood in the middle of the long, dim hospital corridor, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to understand how love could become a weapon sharp enough to cut the same heart that created it. On his left, his mother was screaming his name through tears, begging him not to leave her alone. On his right, his wife was crying silently, begging him not to abandon the family they had promised to build together. Two voices, both sacred, both trembling, both demanding the impossible from the same man. No one knew what had really happened that night, or why Jonathan Hays found himself forced to choose between the woman who gave him life and the woman who gave his life meaning. To the world, it looked like a dramatic emotional crisis, maybe even exaggerated, but it wasn't. It was the result of years of unspoken war, invisible trauma, psychological cracks, and love twisted into loyalty chains. Jonathan never imagined that love could turn into a battlefield where winning meant losing someone forever, and he never imagined he would one day whisper to himself, "Why does love make us choose sides?" His story didn't begin in a hospital corridor or in a dramatic moment. It began quietly, years before, long before love required sacrifice, back when he believed family was destiny and marriage was the reward for a heart capable of loving. Jonathan was raised by Margaret Hays, a woman whose pride could lift nations or crush them. She was brilliant, disciplined, elegant, respected, feared, and endlessly wounded by a past she never fully disclosed. She used strength not as protection, but as armor. She believed vulnerability was a disease that spread through contact, and she promised herself she would never let anyone take her son away. Jonathan admired her like a hero in old stories. She was his shelter, his teacher, his guardian, the only person who never left. But admiration can easily transform into emotional captivity when pain becomes the architect of love. And Margaret built their life with devotion sown to fear. When Jonathan became an adult, he believed he was free. He believed he would chase his dreams without invisible chains. He believed his mother wanted happiness for him. But love shaped by trauma doesn't know how to release, only how to hold tighter. Everything changed the day he met Emma Collins. He wasn't searching for love and she wasn't trying to be noticed. They simply collided, not like fire and fireworks, but like two quiet souls searching for the same kind of silence. Emma had the softness of someone who had been hurt but refused to become cruel. Her eyes didn't judge, they understood. Her voice didn't command, it healed. And her presence didn't demand attention, it invited honesty. Jonathan fell for her not because she was perfect, but because she made the world feel safe without needing to control it. Their connection didn't start with romance. It started with recognition, as if they looked at each other and silently whispered, "You feel it too, don't you? The world can be cruel, but we don't have to be." And for the first time in his life, Jonathan felt something he had never experienced, love that didn't require fear to survive. But Margaret Hays was about to transform that love into the greatest test of his existence. Jonathan met Emma on a calm autumn afternoon inside the university's small counseling center. He wasn't there for therapy. He was there to fulfill his volunteer hours for his psychology program. She wasn't a student at his university. She was a part-time assistant, helping children and adolescents from nearby public schools who struggled emotionally. She didn't talk much, didn't brag, didn't perform. She simply showed up, consistently, gently, and with a level of empathy that felt almost supernatural. The first time Jonathan noticed her was not because she spoke, but because she listened, truly listened, with full presence. A young girl was describing her fear of sleeping alone because she imagined dark things under the bed, and while everyone else tried to rationalize with logic, Emma sat beside her and whispered, "You're safe." Sometimes fears don't need answers, just company. Jonathan stood still, unable to explain why that moment struck him harder than any academic lecture ever did. He realized that wisdom wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a quiet kindness that refused to disappear. Days turned into weeks, and he found himself noticing details. The way she wrote encouraging phrases in tiny, sticky notes and hid them in books. The way she greeted janitors by name. How she carried sadness in her eyes, but joy in her actions. She seemed like someone who had lost a lot, yet chose to love even more, as if pain trained her heart, not poisoned it. They started talking, at first casually, then deeply. Emma confessed she wanted to become a grief counselor for children who lost parents because she had lost both of hers at 14 and had no emotional guidance. She survived, but she didn't want others to merely survive. She wanted them to heal and hope. Jonathan shared that he dreamed of becoming a psychologist, focused on repairing emotional identity, especially for people whose self-worth was shaped by the expectations of others. It wasn't romantic yet. It was something greater, a silent alliance between two wounded souls who still believed in tenderness. They began studying together, walking after classes, sharing stories, fears, memories, and half-broken dreams. Emma taught Jonathan how to breathe slowly when overwhelmed. Jonathan taught Emma how to replace guilt with self-compassion. They laughed quietly, healed softly, and built something invisible but unbreakable. One night, after a long volunteer session, they stood outside under a streetlight flickering like nervous heartbeat. Jonathan hesitated, afraid of crossing the fragile line between connection and confession. But Emma looked at him with eyes that didn't demand, only invited. "Do you ever feel," she asked, voice barely audible, "like the world punishes people who love too deeply?" Jonathan answered without thinking, "Maybe, but I think those people are the ones who save it." Emma exhaled, and there was something sacred in that breath, as if she had finally found someone who spoke her language. From that night forward, Jonathan knew he loved her, not in the rushed, cinematic way people romanticize, but in the quiet, irreversible way that happens when two hearts finally meet someone who understands their scars. However, there was one person who noticed the change in him before he even mentioned Emma, his mother. Margaret Hayes had the kind of intuition that made people uncomfortable. She knew when something shifted in her son, even before he did, and the warmth in his eyes didn't resemble ambition, it resembled peace. To Margaret, peace looked dangerously like distraction. One evening, while Jonathan smiled absent-mindedly at his phone, Margaret asked softly, "Who is teaching you to breathe differently?" That was the moment the war silently began. Jonathan never planned to hide Emma from his mother, but something inside him hesitated, not because he was ashamed of her, but because he already knew how Margaret would react to someone capable of softening his world. It wasn't that Margaret disliked love. She disliked anything she couldn't control. Still, Jonathan believed in honesty, so he decided to introduce the topic gently. One evening, while they were having dinner at the elegant glass dining table, where silence was often served as a side dish, he mentioned, with a careful but genuine tone, "I've been spending time with someone from the counseling center. Her name is Emma." Margaret didn't raise her head. She cut a small piece of her meal, placed it in her mouth, chewed slowly, swallowed, then finally asked, "Is she useful to your goals, or just a pleasant emotion?" Jonathan's heart sank. It wasn't a question, it was a warning disguised as curiosity. "She's meaningful," he replied, voice steady but cautious. Margaret nodded once, still not looking at him, and ended the conversation with a calm, surgical sentence. "Meaning without purpose is a luxury most people cannot afford." That night, Jonathan realized his mother didn't fear Emma as a person. She feared Emma as a possibility. Weeks later, Jonathan took Emma to a quiet botanical garden on the outskirts of the city. It was sunset, and the sky looked like it was painted with fragile promises, gold fading into orange fading into memory. They walked along a small lake, where flower petals floated like lost thoughts. Emma stopped, staring at the water. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" Jonathan asked gently. "Of not being enough for the life you're expected to live." Her vulnerability pierced him deeper than any argument could. He took her hands and spoke slowly, intentionally, almost as if sealing a sacred pact. "You don't have to be enough for expectations. Just be real with me. I don't want a perfect life. I want a meaningful one. And if I ever have to choose between what looks successful and what feels like home, I will always choose home." Emma closed her eyes, letting those words sink into every wound she tried to hide. She didn't need flowers or rings to feel chosen. That promise was a lifetime vow. They stayed there until the sky turned dark, and for the first time, Emma allowed herself to believe that love didn't have to end in abandonment. However, destiny often tests the promises it hears. The first fracture happened when Emma unexpectedly visited Jonathan at his home to return a notebook he had forgotten. She assumed it was harmless. Love should never require scheduling. But when Margaret opened the door, her eyes scanned Emma like a security checkpoint searching for flaws. Emma introduced herself kindly, offering a warm smile and extending her hand. Margaret didn't shake it. Instead, she stepped aside just enough to let Emma in, as if granting permission rather than welcome. The atmosphere felt like walking into a museum where touching anything was forbidden. Emma sat on the sofa, hands folded, while Margaret observed her like she was studying a long-term investment risk. "What does your family do?" Margaret asked, tone neutral but blade sharp. Emma swallowed before answering truthfully, "I don't have family anymore. I lost my parents in my teens." Margaret's eyes didn't soften. Instead, they hardened, as if emotional tragedy was a stain rather than a scar. "I'm sorry to hear that," she replied, "but people with no roots often struggle to understand legacy." Emma remained composed, but Jonathan noticed her fingers trembling slightly. He tried to shift the conversation to safer territory, but the air was already poisoned. When Emma left, Margaret closed the door and stated coldly, without confrontation or volume, "She carries pain, Jonathan. Pain doesn't build, it consumes." Jonathan felt something break inside him, but he didn't respond. Silence became his first betrayal, not toward his mother, but toward Emma. That night, when Emma asked if she had done something wrong, he forced a smile and said, "Everything was fine." But inside, the first emotional crack had appeared, and Margaret had noticed it. After that night, something subtle but corrosive began to spread between Jonathan and Emma. Not mistrust, not doubt, but fear. Not fear of each other, but fear of hurting each other, and fear when silent becomes the invisible architect of distance. Margaret didn't confront Jonathan openly. She didn't shout, threaten, or forbid. She understood a deeper truth. Love is easier to break from the inside. So she planted questions instead of rules. She left carefully chosen comments around the house like emotional traps, disguised as parental concern. Some people love because they need healing, not because they know how to build. She looks soft. Soft things collapse in storms. Pain can make a person cling to whoever offers comfort, not necessarily to who offers a future. Jonathan tried ignoring it, but unspoken words tend to echo louder than spoken ones. Meanwhile, Emma sensed an emotional shift, not always, but in moments where Jonathan seemed mentally absent. She tried asking gently, but Jonathan hated the idea of burdening her with problems caused by the very person he loved. So he kept smiling, even while something inside him tightened like a knot. Then came the first major test. Jonathan had an important academic seminar, one that could open doors to prestigious postgraduate programs. Emma promised to attend and support him, sitting in the audience. However, that same afternoon, a young boy at the counseling center suffered a severe panic breakdown triggered by memories of domestic violence. Emma refused to leave until he stabilized, and she arrived at the seminar very late. Missing Jonathan's presentation entirely, she ran into the auditorium hallway breathless, devastated, whispering, "I'm so sorry," before she even reached him. Jonathan wasn't angry, but he was visibly hurt. Emma tried to explain that she couldn't abandon the child, but her voice cracked midway. Jonathan understood her heart, but pain doesn't need logic to exist. When they got home, Margaret was waiting, and she already knew. Someone had informed her through connections. She spoke slowly, with surgical precision. "Jonathan, a partner must prioritize your future, not compete with it." Emma tried to defend herself respectfully. "I didn't compete. I helped someone who was breaking." Margaret smiled faintly as if pitying the naivety. "Intentions don't build stability. Results do." Jonathan tried ending the conversation, but Margaret delivered one final strike. "You deserve someone who protects your path, not someone who tests how much you're willing to sacrifice." Emma lowered her gaze, holding her tears like a prisoner holds breath. Obstacle 1. Emotional scarcity versus moral duty. Triggered. Weeks later, Margaret invited Jonathan to a private dinner at an exclusive club, without mentioning Emma. To avoid conflict, he initially declined, explaining he and Emma had plans. Margaret didn't argue. She simply sighed, placed her hand over her chest dramatically, and whispered, "I sometimes feel like I'm losing the only person I built my life around. But don't worry. Go enjoy your evening." Guilt, heavy and unseen, wrapped itself around Jonathan like chains made of promises. After long hesitation, he cancelled his evening with Emma and went to the dinner. When he returned home, Emma didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't demand. She simply asked, "Did she make you feel responsible for her sadness?" Jonathan couldn't answer. Silence admitted everything. That night, Emma held herself while crying quietly, not because she felt unloved, but because she finally understood that love wasn't the only force inside Jonathan's life. Obstacle 2. Loyalty conflict and emotional guilt programming. Activated. For the first time, Emma wondered if love alone was enough, and for the first time, Jonathan felt torn between two different definitions of family, but the decisive blow had not yet arrived. It was coming, planned, timed and disguised as destiny. Months passed, and even though Jonathan and Emma still loved one another deeply, something had shifted beneath the surface, like quiet cracks forming under a beautiful building. The relationship was still standing, but the foundation was slowly being eroded by conflicting loyalties Jonathan never learned how to balance. Emma noticed how often Jonathan measured his words before speaking, as if every sentence needed to pass through an invisible filter named, "Will this cause conflict later?" She also noticed how he never spoke negatively about his mother, not out of respect, but out of fear that acknowledging truth would make it real. And Margaret noticed something too. Emma wasn't breaking, she was enduring. So she changed strategies. Instead of attacking Emma, she began praising alternative futures. She casually left brochures of prestigious institutions around the house, mentioning scholarships abroad, elite internships, and marriage alliances that would strengthen the family legacy. She never mentioned Emma's name again. Erasing can be more violent than insulting. She told Jonathan in a casual tone one morning, "People marry either to elevate their lives or to escape their wounds. One relationship creates destiny, the other creates dependency. Choose wisely, son." The words echoed inside him like scripture he never asked to memorize. Not long after, Jonathan received a life-changing email. He had been shortlisted for a globally recognized postgraduate fellowship in Switzerland, a program that accepted only 12 students per year, fully funded, with access to research labs and mentorship that could launch his career internationally. It was the opportunity he had dreamed of since childhood. He ran to tell Emma, breathless, joyful, overflowing with gratitude, expecting celebration. And Emma did smile, genuinely proud of him. She hugged him, whispered, "You deserve this," and meant every word. But then came the condition. The program required 2 full years abroad, with minimal breaks and mandatory campus residency. That meant distance, and distance meant uncertainty. Emma didn't panic. She simply asked a question that revealed her soul. Are we strong enough to love through oceans and time zones, while also fighting a war we still haven't named? Jonathan froze, because he didn't know whether she was asking for reassurance or honesty. Later that night, Margaret entered his room quietly. "This is your moment, not hers. Don't lose a lifetime opportunity for someone still trying to fix the pieces of her past." Jonathan defended Emma gently, but Margaret interrupted with a cold, calculated truth that stabbed deeper than any insult. "You're trying to rescue someone who's still learning how to rescue herself. Love isn't charity, Jonathan." And then the final blow. "If she truly loved you, she would let you go chase what you've earned." Those words became poison, disguised as wisdom. For days, Jonathan lived inside a storm of silence. He didn't tell Emma what his mother said, because he feared it would sound too real. He didn't tell his mother what Emma felt, because he feared it would sound too emotional. And silence, once born, began devouring everything. Emma soon sensed that Jonathan was no longer celebrating, he was calculating. His joy had turned into fear of choosing wrong. She apologized for even asking questions about the future, but Jonathan didn't want apologies. He wanted clarity he couldn't produce. One evening, Emma finally said what she had been afraid to say. "I want you to go, but I don't want to lose us. I just don't know if your mother will let us exist while you're far away." Jonathan felt his chest collapse, because truth spoken gently hurts more than lies screamed loudly. That night, unable to sleep, he stepped outside and walked aimlessly until he reached the rooftop of their first real conversation. The wind was cold, but the memory was warm. He stared at the horizon and whispered to the sky, "Why does love demand sacrifice only from the one who holds it gently?" He wished for a sign, a miracle, anything, but instead, reality arrived. Because the very next day, something happened that neither love nor reason could easily repair. 2 days later, Emma received an unexpected call from the counseling center. A teenage boy she had been working with, Daniel, a 15-year-old who struggled with abandonment trauma, had attempted to run away from home after a violent argument with his father. The police found him wandering near a bus station, terrified, shaking, and refusing to speak to anyone but Emma. Without hesitation, she rushed to the center. Without hesitation, she stayed until he calmed down. Without hesitation, she cancelled every personal plan she had that evening. including the celebratory dinner Jonathan's mother had organized, a dinner Jonathan assumed Emma would attend because she had promised she would be there. Jonathan arrived with flowers and a carefully ironed suit. Margaret was beautifully dressed, smiling like a queen welcoming diplomats. The restaurant table was reserved with elegance: white candles, velvet chairs, champagne chilling, and a congratulatory banner that read, "To the future Dr. Hayes, legacy begins now." But Emma never arrived. Jonathan tried calling her. No answer. He texted. No reply. He waited. An hour passed. Then 2. Margaret didn't say anything at first, but the silence around her was almost triumphant. By the time Emma finally called, Jonathan was already walking back to his car, embarrassment burning through him. She answered with her tired voice full of remorse. "Jonathan, I'm so sorry. Something happened with Daniel. He needed me. I stayed with him." He interrupted, not with anger, but with something far worse: resignation. "You could have told me. You could have sent one message." Emma's voice cracked. "I didn't even look at my phone. I was afraid something would happen if I stepped away, even for a moment." Jonathan closed his eyes. He understood, but pain doesn't negotiate with understanding. He didn't yell. He didn't blame her. He simply whispered, "I needed you too." Emma cried in silence that entire night, realizing that being needed by the world came with the cost of disappointing the person she loved the most. The next morning, Jonathan woke up to find his mother sitting calmly in the living room, sipping tea like a queen after winning a quiet war. "She will always choose her wounds," she said softly. "You must choose your future." Those words settled into Jonathan's mind like seeds planted in fertile ground. For the first time he wondered, is love supposed to be peaceful, or is it supposed to be prioritized? Days later, the acceptance letter arrived with the final deadline. Jonathan had to respond within 72 hours. His pulse raced, his thoughts fought, and his soul felt pulled apart like paper in opposite directions. He met Emma at the same botanical garden where he had once made his promise, where love had felt like destiny, not dilemma. Emma arrived holding a letter of her own, a recommendation that would allow her to pursue advanced certification to specialize in child trauma therapy. It was her dream too, but she didn't mention it first. She talked only about him. "If you go, I will wait for you," she said, voice trembling but sincere. Jonathan looked into her eyes and saw truth, love, loyalty, fear, and hope all at once. And then he asked the question that changed everything. "Will you be able to keep loving me, even if my choice hurts you first?" Emma didn't answer immediately. Tears fell before words did. "I love you enough to let you become who you're meant to be," she whispered. "Even if I'm not part of that version." Those were the most selfless and most heartbreaking words Jonathan had ever heard, and Margaret didn't have to say anything. Jonathan didn't sleep at all during the final night before the deadline. He walked through the empty rooms of the house, touching familiar objects as if searching for answers inside them. His mother's framed diplomas on the wall looked like silent judges, while the memory of Emma's gentle laugh echoed like a forgotten lullaby. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his own reflection, asking a question few dare to confront. What version of me do I want to live with for the rest of my life? Morning arrived without permission. The fellowship committee was waiting. His phone was on the table. The decision could be made in a single sentence. Jonathan closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and pressed send. A confirmation email appeared instantly. He accepted the program. The moment felt like achieving a lifetime dream, yet his chest felt like it was collapsing from the inside. Dreams shouldn't taste like guilt, yet this one did, bitter and unforgettable. He went to see Emma that afternoon. She stood at the counseling center entrance, already knowing the answer the moment she saw his face. He didn't need to speak. Heartbreak has a recognizable expression. Emma didn't cry at first. She simply placed her hand on his chest, right over his heartbeat, as if memorizing its rhythm for the last time. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Jonathan swallowed hard. "I don't want to lose you." Emma smiled sadly. "You won't lose me, but you won't keep me either." She took a deep breath, fighting every instinct telling her to beg him to stay. But love built on truth refuses to trap. "You once told me you would always choose what feels like home," she said softly, "and I hope one day you understand that home is not a place. It's the heart that waits for you without conditions." Jonathan wanted to hold her forever, but he didn't. He respected her dignity more than his longing. They hugged for a long time, the type of hug that doesn't promise return, only gratitude. Just before letting go, Emma whispered her final words. Become everything you dream of. Just promise me you won't become someone who stops feeling. He kissed her forehead, not like a lover, but like someone honoring a chapter that would never be repeated. That night, Margaret prepared an extravagant celebration meal. She smiled, she toasted, she congratulated, but something unexpected happened. Jonathan didn't feel relief. He felt empty. His mother raised her glass and said, "To choices that build empires." Jonathan raised his slowly and replied, "To choices that cost everything, for a fraction of—" A second, Margaret's eyes flickered, not with victory but with something she would never admit, fear. Because Jonathan's tone wasn't proud, it was broken. 3 weeks later, he boarded his flight. He stared out the window, not at the clouds, but at everything he left behind. His chest ached with a silent truth. He didn't know whether he was going toward his future or away from his soul. Switzerland was breathtaking. Postcard landscapes, universities that looked like palaces of intellect, professors whose wisdom felt larger than life. Jonathan was surrounded by brilliance, opportunity, innovation, and global prestige. The world finally saw him as someone exceptional, but success felt strangely quiet. He excelled academically, impressing supervisors with his insight and composure. His work was meticulous, his research promising, yet every achievement felt like clapping that echoed in an empty auditorium. At night, when the campus lights dimmed and the students gathered in cafes laughing freely, Jonathan walked alone along the icy paths, wondering whether ambition tastes less like triumph and more like loneliness when served without love. He tried focusing only on progress, convincing himself that time heals everything, but time does not heal what it never touches, and distance only magnifies what was left unresolved. He thought of Emma constantly, how she tied her hair when focused, how she whispered comfort instead of solutions, how she listened like listening was a gift. He never tried to replace her, not because he couldn't, but because some loves are so unique they become part of identity, not memory. Meanwhile, back home, Margaret believed she had secured Jonathan's destiny. Her friends praised her parenting, her discipline, her vision. She accepted every compliment with a smile, yet she secretly wondered why Jonathan's messages had become so formal, so brief, so emotionally distant. He still respected her, and always would, but something within him had quietly shifted. He no longer confided. He no longer sought approval. He no longer shared his inner world. And that, for Margaret, felt more threatening than losing an argument. 6 months into the program, Jonathan received a package at his dorm. There was no sender name, only a familiar handwriting. Inside was a small envelope containing a single item, a pressed flower, perfectly preserved between 2 thin sheets. It was from the lake in the botanical garden, the place where Emma had once said she wanted to build a life based on meaning, not perfection. There was also a short note. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm only reminding you that your heart once bloomed without needing applause." There were no accusations, no guilt, no drama, only truth. Jonathan sat on his bed and cried for the first time since leaving home. He realized he didn't miss a relationship. He missed the version of himself who could love without calculation. From that moment on, something changed inside him. He became more compassionate with his research subjects. He questioned the psychology of emotional loyalty and identity. He wrote articles about attachment wounds and inherited trauma, subconsciously writing his own diagnosis. One of his professors praised his work, saying, "You speak like someone who understands pain, not from books, but from experience. That will make you a remarkable psychologist." Jonathan smiled, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. 2 years passed. He completed his program with honors. He received offers for international research positions. He was celebrated in academic circles. Yet when graduation day arrived and he held the certificate that symbolized everything he was told to chase, his hands trembled with a quiet question. Was this worth the cost? In the evening, he packed his bags. Not for another program, not for another city, but for the place he once called home, carrying a heart full of knowledge and a soul full of regret. Jonathan arrived back home on a cold, grey afternoon. The city looked the same, but something in him made everything feel unfamiliar, as if he were walking through a place built from old memories rather than current reality. His mother greeted him with pride, wrapped in silk and perfume, congratulating him on his success, already planning dinners, interviews and introductions. But Jonathan didn't come home to celebrate. He came to confront what was left unfinished. After a night of forced smiles and carefully curated conversations, he excused himself, saying he needed air. Instead, he drove directly to the counseling center, not knowing whether Emma still worked there or whether time had carried her somewhere else. The building was quiet, and the reception area had been renovated, but her name was still on a small silver plaque near the office door. Emma Collins, Trauma and Grief Support Specialist. He felt a tremor inside his chest. He hesitated before knocking, rehearsing apologies that suddenly felt inadequate, but before he could raise his hand, the door opened. Emma stepped out, older, calmer, stronger. Her eyes still held kindness, but now there was something new in them, complete emotional grounding. She didn't look angry, surprised, or flustered. She simply looked at him the way one looks at a chapter long understood, with peace. "Hi, Jonathan," she said softly. His voice almost broke. "Hi." They walked to the garden behind the center, where benches were surrounded by flowers planted by the children. He tried to speak first, but she gently placed a hand on his arm, not to comfort, but to center him. "You don't owe me explanations," she began. "We made the best decisions we were capable of with the hearts we had at that time." Jonathan shook his head slowly. "I hurt you." Emma took a long, steady breath. "And I healed. That's what matters." He closed his eyes, fighting 1,000 words at once. "I never stopped loving you," he confessed. Emma smiled, but her smile wasn't nostalgic. It was grateful. "I know. But love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means letting both people become who they needed to be." There was no bitterness, no blame, only truth spoken with maturity earned through pain. She told him she now led programs nationwide, training professionals to deal with childhood trauma. She had found purpose not despite her pain, but through it. Her life had grown, not as compensation, but as continuation. Jonathan felt proud and devastated at the same time. He finally asked, "Would there ever be a chance for us again?" Emma didn't hesitate, but her answer was gentle and final. "We were not a mistake. We were a beginning. But love must meet at the right time, not just in the right heart." Then she reached into her bag and handed him a small envelope, similar to the one she had sent overseas. Inside was another pressed flower, but this one was different, fully bloomed, not preserved from the past, but picked recently. "It's not a memory," she said. "It's a blessing." Jonathan felt tears gather. "Thank you, Emma." "For what?" she asked softly. "For loving me in a way that taught me how to love myself." They hugged, not with desperation, but closure, and for the first time, their goodbye didn't hurt. It completed. Jonathan drove home in silence, holding the pressed flower inside his jacket like a fragile universe. He didn't cry out of loss. He cried out of recognition. For the first time, he understood that love is not measured by who stays, but by who helps us become more whole, even if they must leave in the process. When he arrived, Margaret was waiting in the living room, dressed elegantly as always, prepared to celebrate his achievements. But something in his expression made her sit down slowly, as if instinct warned her that destiny had finally come to collect its price. Jonathan stood in front of her. No anger, no tears, no accusations, only truth. "Mom," he began gently, "I achieved everything you dreamed of, but I didn't become who I dreamed of." Margaret remained silent, her breathing barely audible. "I don't regret pursuing my goals," he continued, "but I regret believing that love was something that could wait until success was finished. I thought I was choosing my future, but I was choosing a version of myself that didn't know how to stay human in the process." Her eyes trembled, but she hid it behind composure. "You blame me?" she whispered. He shook his head immediately. "No, I don't blame you. You taught me strength. You taught me discipline. You taught me to never quit. But somewhere along the way, I learned to win without learning how to nurture what matters." A long silence filled the room, heavy but sacred. Then Jonathan spoke the sentence that freed both of them. "You raised me to survive life. Emma taught me how to live it." Margaret looked away as her eyes watered, the first visible sign of vulnerability he had ever seen from her. Her voice came out thin, almost fragile. "I was afraid that love would take you away from me." Jonathan knelt beside her and gently held her hands. "Love doesn't take, Mom. Fear does." A single tear escaped Margaret's eye. She didn't wipe it, and in that moment, two truths finally confronted each other. Her strength had built him. His vulnerability would save him. Years later, Jonathan became a renowned psychologist, specializing in emotional identity, relational wounds, and generational trauma. His seminars were always full, not because of academic prestige, but because he spoke with a depth that no textbook could teach. He never married out of urgency, loneliness, or replacement. He chose to wait until love felt like partnership rather than rescue, freedom rather than fear, alignment rather than negotiation. Sometimes he visited the botanical garden, sitting by the lake where everything had once begun. He didn't return to rewrite the past. He returned to honor it. Emma continued changing lives, training professionals, creating safe environments for children who had nowhere else to heal. She loved again, slowly, gently, wisely, and she was happy, not because she forgot, but because she grew from what was real. Jonathan and Emma didn't reunite romantically, but they remained connected by something rarer than forever: gratitude without possession, love without chains, memory without pain. And whenever Jonathan was asked in interviews, "What is the most important lesson about love?" he always answered, "True love doesn't demand choosing between who you love and who you are. The right person won't ask you to shrink. They will meet you where growth still hurts." Then he would smile and finish, "Success is what I built. Love is who I became." The audience always applauded, and not for the words, but for the truth they recognized inside themselves, and that was the legacy he chose. Before you leave, don't forget to subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, city and state. I'd love to know how far this story traveled.